Okay, good evening everybody. I hope this is working. My name is Adeke Adebaju. I'm Director of the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation. We have a wonderful panel here. We're still expecting one more, Dr. Mashabane, who should be with us soon. And I'll introduce our panelists just before they speak. I think it will make it a bit more dramatic than just introducing everybody in one go and then they get lost. I just want to acknowledge some of diplomatic corps members that confirmed. I don't know whether they're here, but the ambassadors of Namibia, Malawi, Spain, the British ambassador, the Dutch, Lithuania, Chile, and the deputy Australian ambassador. So in case they show up, at least we know all protocol observed. Let's get straight to it, and I want to try to keep everybody to 10 minutes each in terms of our speakers so that we can actually have proper discussion, and we're starting a bit late, so there is quite a bit of onus on us to make sure that we keep to the time. And I'll describe the order in which we'll speak in a minute. So, the concentric circles of South Africa's foreign policy is what I title the introduction. It's an often repeated truism in foreign policy that countries can only be strong abroad if they're strong at home. Post-Apartheid South Africa remains one of the world's most unequal societies. However, South Africa is also the only African country that's a member of the BRICS and the G20, and the only African country among 11 strategic actors of the European Union. There was thus an urgent need to produce a study on South Africa's post-apartheid foreign policy like this one that covers both its main themes and its geographical scope in a conceptually coherent manner. Many of the previous books on this subject are now dated. So what we're trying to do, this is the book itself, and I have to mention also that it is on sale for the, I think, bargain price of about $350, is it? Yeah, so I mean for a 500-page book like this, which is biblical, I would say, without being sacrilegious, we're trying to basically produce the Bible of post-apartheid South Africa's foreign policy. And one of the selling points in the book is also that we have 6 practitioners from the ministries of Foreign Ministry, Trade, Defense, and also Eddie Maloka, who is now the CEO of the APRM. I'll introduce him in a minute. And so we're trying to encourage real debate, dialogue between practitioners and scholars. The volume is divided into 5 parts. The first examines the domestic imperatives of South Africa's foreign policy, peacemaking, defense and security, human rights, and corporate economic expansion. The second and third parts of the book assess South Africa's key bilateral and multilateral relations in Africa, while the fourth and fifth analyze the country's key external, bilateral, and multilateral relations. South Africa's post-apartheid foreign policy is thus examined in terms of 4 overlapping concentric circles, with the first focusing on the domestic South African constraints, the second on the Southern African sub-region, the third on the broader African region, and then a 4th concentric circle dealing with relations outside of Africa. And the concept of hegemony is also used to explain South Africa's leadership ambitions in Africa. Nelson Mandela famously outlined 5 principles to guide South Africa's foreign policy in a famous article in the US establishment journal Foreign Affairs in 1993. The centrality of human rights, the promotion of democracy, respect for international law, pursuit of peace through nonviolent mechanisms, and international cooperation. Thabo Mbeki, at a foreign policy retreat with South African ambassadors in 2001, also identified 5 key priorities for South Africa: restructuring the AU and SADC, reforming the UN, the WTO, the World Bank, and the IMF, hosting major international conferences, promoting peace and security in Africa and the Middle East, and fostering ties with G8 industrialized countries, as well as trying to develop a coherent global South strategy. So South Africa under Mbeki came up with an African agenda in which he basically deployed 3,000 troops to Burundi and the DRC. So Thabo Mbeki acted as a Pied Piper of Pretoria, calling the diplomatic tunes to which warlords, rebels, and soldiers danced in these countries. And in the space of a short decade and a half, South Africa went from being the most destabilizing power in Africa under the apartheid era to being its most energetic peacemaker. President Jacob Zuma also continued the African agenda, with South Africa having established 44 embassies in Africa by 2017, while pursuing what some described as a national interest-driven foreign policy. So it was a more mercantilist trade policy, seeking to position South Africa as the gateway to Africa. South Africa's entry into BRICS by 2010 was a major diplomatic triumph for President Zuma. And whereas Mbeki basically sought leadership at the continental level, which he wasn't always able to translate into influence at the Southern African level, Zuma, by establishing a strategic relationship with Angola, was able to have more influence, arguably, at the continental level. And one example is the SADC-driven appointment of Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma as AU Commission Chair in 2012. So the first concentric circle involves the domestic constraints on South Africa's foreign policy, with its economy and senior levels of key institutions such as academia, NGOs, and the military continuing to be dominated by 10% white minority. Unemployment has remained stubbornly stuck at an unofficial 40%, officially around 27%, and white-dominated South African companies are ubiquitous across the continent. Moving to the second concentric circle, Zimbabwean scholar Lloyd Sachikonye argues in the volume that while South Africa's ties with Mozambique were close, those with Zimbabwe ambivalent, there was a warming of ties with Angola only after 2009, when Zuma went on the first state visit there. Congolese scholar George Nzongola focuses in his chapter on South Africa's peacemaking role in the DRC and Burundi, and criticizes South Africa's efforts, as he sees it, to export its government of national unity model abroad, and also criticizes the economic interest in what he sees as South Africa's peacemaking role in the Congo. He looks at the fractious relationship with Rwanda as well. In my chapter, I look at the three biggest economies in West Africa: Nigeria, Ghana, and Cote d'Ivoire. Kenyan scholar Gilbert Kadiagala shows in his chapter how Tanzania and Uganda have been used as bridges for South Africa's peacemaking in the Great Lakes, while Egyptian scholar Rawia Taufik assesses South Africa's relations with Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria in the aftermath of the Afro-Arab Spring of 2011. Within the second of our four concentric circles, South Africa's key multilateral ties in Southern Africa are looked at through SACU and SADC, and many of Southern Africa's other 220 million citizens still fear that these contemporary institutions could be used as instruments by Black-led government to fulfill the historical expansionist aims of South Africa's albinocratic leaders and big business. Moving from the second to the third concentric circle, South African scholar diplomat Eddie Moloka looks at relations with the AU and South Africa's building of many of its institutions under Mbeki, and you'll hear from him directly. The fourth concentric circle looks at bilateral relations with Britain, France, the US, and China. And British relations suffered some tensions over Zimbabwe, but the Anglophile Mandela and Mbeki basically maintained quite good relations. The book also examines Franco-South African relations, which were a bit fraught, and there's a trenchant chapter by Frenchman Roland Marchal, which looks at the conflict and cooperation between both countries. American analyst Steve Wiseman portrays the South Africa-US relationship as a pragmatic one in which, though they worked together in peacemaking, there was also disagreement over the US military role in Africa. And Chinese scholar Liu Haifeng, in her chapter, notes that though South African policymakers tend to see the China relationship as one that's strategic, China in fact tends to be much more pragmatic in the way it approaches it. The final part, the fourth concentric circle, also looks at South Africa's multilateral ties at the UN, BRICS, ACP, EU, and the World Trade Organization, and we'll hear about those relations shortly. So while South Africa, in conclusion, is clearly a regional hegemon, it's far from being a global power with a permanent seat on the UN Security Council and commensurate weight in institutions of global governance like the World Bank and the IMF. Hegemonic theory describes a gatekeeping role in which regional gatekeepers seek to fence off their own region from meddling external powers. South Africa and Nigeria appear to be starting to collaborate more closely in response to continuing French and American military presence in Africa. And I ask the question in closing that working with countries like Angola and Algeria, could Pax South Africana and Pax Nigeriana formulate a future continental Monroe Doctrine that keeps Paris and Washington out of Africa in search of what Kenyan scholar Ali Mazrui described as a Pax Africana? So that's the opening to the book. And I now want to go straight to Nicole Fritz. We're going to take this in the order of the concentric circles. So we'll look at some of the domestic challenges, human rights and defense and security. And then we'll look at relations with the AU. And then we'll look at the EU and we'll look at the UN. So Nicole is CEO of Freedom Under Law, Johannesburg. She was the founder of the Johannesburg-based Southern African Litigation Center and served as its executive director for 10 years. She's an extraordinary adjunct lecturer at the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria and also at the Wits School of Law, and previously taught at Fordham University in New York. She holds an LLB from Wits and an LLM from New York University. So Nicole, the floor is yours.
I don't know if that admonition was specifically directed at me, Adi, but I intend to keep the input high. I did like the analogy of the book to the Bible, and given that I'm the first person called, I guess that would make me the author of Genesis. But yes, well, we don't know who, in fact, the author of Genesis is, but yes, that would be a turn for the books, Eve. So I have been asked to address essentially my chapter, which is the role of human rights in South Africa's foreign policy. This has been a fairly controversial topic. Many of you will know that in the first years following South Africa's democracy, South Africa, in fact, received much acclaim for what was perceived to be a normatively driven, a foreign policy that was consistent with the values espoused in its constitution. And obviously, human rights represent a key portion of our constitution, enshrined as they are in the Bill of Rights. South Africa, in fact, was said to be part of this club of global Good Samaritans, using its leverage, the history of the struggle against apartheid, to garner soft power and to speak in support of the promotion and protection of human rights globally. And that was evidenced in, for instance, the very critical role it played in the formation of institutions like the International Criminal Court. Some years thereafter, the picture changed, and South Africa was now met with some bewilderment around the globe. It was said to be betraying its founding values of having sold out, and it met with a large degree of criticism. I want to suggest that an examination of the record suggests that a more measured assessment is warranted. It is neither sort of entirely global good Samaritan nor the devil incarnate in its exercise of foreign policy. I think when South Africa does tend to depart from its normative values, those specifically upheld in the Constitution, it does so in two contexts. The first being where regional solidarity, unity, demands that it departs from its normative human rights principles, and the second instance being where it believes that its principled stance of demanding a fairer world order and reforms in order to ensure restructuring of global governance so that it is more equitable, demands that they take these positions. I want to suggest that sometimes South Africa, in holding these two positions oppositionally, so promoting and protecting human rights at the global level and advocating for reform of the global order, is sometimes a false choice. And in fact, South Africa's positions vis-a-vis human rights can be used tactically in order to advance calls for reform of the global order. That said, you may have seen recently that there was great controversy when Nikki Haley, the United States ambassador to the United Nations, said that she would be taking names. She would be reporting to President Donald Trump because it was egregious that the US, despite paying most of the fees contributed to the UN, in fact didn't get a very good return on its expenditure, that large numbers of countries were voting at odds with the United States. And she then went on to list the 10 countries that consistently take positions, most consistently take positions at odds with the United States positions. And South Africa was among those 10 countries. Given what I think is a fairly extraordinarily overt bully boy tactics, you perhaps could feel some pride for South Africa's stance. But the club in which South Africa finds itself, in fact, those 10 states, is hardly one to be proud of. Most of those other 10 states are notorious for their record as violators of human rights, like Syria, like Russia. And I also would suggest that if South Africa is to be successful in corralling reform at the global governance level, it will have to appeal to those nations and societies who find the peers of this group in which South Africa finds itself to be morally repugnant. So whilst South Africa rightly challenges the United States, I think it is going to have to find a more tactical way to win support without repelling those who would ordinarily be sympathetic to South Africa's righteous stance of seeking reforms. What I want to do now, very briefly, in the remaining time that I have, is just look at two examples where I think we see play out this notion that South Africa departs from a stance which would advance and protect human rights, both to strengthen both to advance a regional position of solidarity, and where it believes it is doing so effectively, to protest the duplicity, the inequality at the global level. And so the first example to look at is that of the International Criminal Court. Now, many of you will know that that in fact South Africa was key to the establishment of the International Criminal Court. South Africa's then Justice Minister Della Omar, together with his advisor Madadre Lamira, were key, in fact, in pushing back on those states that wanted an international criminal court that was less independent, that was more beholden to the Security Council, chief among them being the United States. And South Africa was able to help ensure that there was a coalition of like-minded states who had sufficient numbers to prevail in this. And I think what also has to be kept in mind is that, of course, I mean, as we look back at the transitional moment in South Africa, and there's a lot of criticism of that transitional moment, I think those who were, within the ANC leadership at the time were conscious of the weakness of the transitional moment, of the very painful compromises that had to be made. And so that somebody like Kader Asmal, who was a big supporter and champion of an institution like the International Criminal Court when it was formed, would say, part of what was motivating South Africa was trying to ensure that the moment, South Africa's transitional moment, would never have to be repeated, so that those responsible for crimes against humanity, no matter what their seniority, would not be able to go free, go unindicted for their crimes. So you have South Africa playing this role in the formation of the International Criminal Court, and for several years, it playing a very constructive role, looking at trying to support efforts to ensure domestication of the International Criminal Court, so that states, particularly in Africa, but around the world, had the means domestically to ensure prosecution. So you weren't just handing up these powers to a global institution. And in fact, I was, as Adi has alluded, I was the head of the Southern Africa Litigation Center during some of these years. We saw some indictments handed down, and I think when the attitude towards the International Criminal Court changed. Very unfortunately, the International Criminal Court, specifically under its initial prosecutor, Louis Moreno Ocampo, ensured that the indictments were all directed at African leaders. Situations were African. It should also be recognized that a number of those situations were self-referrals. So it wasn't a choice on the part of the International Criminal Court. Those states, in fact, sought the intervention of the International Criminal Court.
Nicole, you're going to have to round up.
Okay.
Unfortunately.
All right, so I have...
I didn't want to stand right behind you because I realize I'm a big black man. Or a tall black man, that's it.
Yes.
Well, please try to round up so
Sure.
that we can get through the group.
Sure. So very briefly, what you have is South Africa then change its position, and in fact, in the wake, in the aftermath of Omar al-Bashir having visited South Africa and an attempt made to secure his arrest warrant, South Africa then seek to withdraw from the International Criminal Court. That attempt has been stymied in that the courts have held that procedurally South Africa hasn't acted as it should, and the efforts, its parliamentary efforts thus far, are in effect null and void. That doesn't prevent South Africa from going back and remedying the process. So whilst there hasn't been very much news about this of late, it's still maybe the case that South Africa withdraws from the International Criminal Court. I think that's a very, and perhaps in discussion we can talk about the record of the International Criminal Court, but obviously South Africa having withdrawn from an institution that it was so critical in founding is a tragedy. I think domestically and globally. And it was done so. South Africa certainly upheld its rationale for having done so, as in part to protest what it saw to be the duplicity, global double standards. And then very quickly, just to wrap up, the other tribunal to have a look at is that of the SADC tribunal, which previously permitted individuals from the SADC states to approach the tribunal and to resolve disputes between them and the states. There was then an attempt, largely at Zimbabwe's instigation, to change the powers of the tribunal. And the tribunal, there was then a decision made by heads of state to suspend the tribunal. South Africa was party to that decision. And then President Zuma appended his signature to a new protocol, which meant that the future tribunal would in fact no longer have powers to adjudicate disputes between individuals and their states, but would only resolve interstate disputes. So taking away a key mechanism by which citizens within the region could look to resolve their states. There, in fact, and again, we can talk about this in more detail, South Africa, in fact, was one of the states least opposed to the decimation of the tribunal. But it was regional solidarity, I think, which required that it take the position it did, although there was some discomfort with it having done so. But that second instance is an example where regional solidarity, South Africa felt demanded of it, that it take a position at odds with its normative values. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Nicole, I've been forced to give you an extra 3 minutes. And we'll just store that in the bank. The next person is Segren Naidu, who is Director of Defense Policy Formulation in South Africa's Department of Defense. And from 2011 to 2015, he headed the Secretariat of the Defense Review Committee, which produced the South African Defense Review of 2015. He previously worked as a researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs and the Institute for Global Dialogues, and holds a master's from Rhodes University. So, Segren, the floor is yours, 10 minutes.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here at the book launch. I don't know how biblical this book is, but I think you should read it religiously. Once again, extremely honored to be a contributor to this publication. And I thank everyone who created it and produced its materialization. I give special thanks to the editors, even though they gave me a hard time. I see my chapter is very much the way I wanted it to be. Thank you.
You've taken 1 minute.
It's worth it. South Africa's defense and security role in articulating the post-apartheid defense function and security role, I've attempted to reflect on what I and quite a few others have referred to as or termed a predicament, which essentially refers to the challenge of balancing the post-apartheid domestic defense obligations and the priorities which were unforeseen and actually to an extent unexpected, the unforeseen priorities of the external environment. In other words, the South African National Defence Force, since its formation, has endured a constant mismatch between the roles and responsibilities prescribed for it on one end, and the operations it has been called upon to undertake in an unpredictable security environment. So as a consequence, the SANDF has often lacked the capabilities to respond more effectively, not just to respond, but to respond more effectively, that's my argument, to the demands that have been placed on it. In the chapter, I argue that the nature of the post-apartheid states did not allow for the appropriate restructuring and consolidation of the SANDF in a manner that required for it to undertake its varied post-apartheid responsibilities more effectively. In my chapter, I reflect on how the immediate post-apartheid years were characterized by a predominantly introverted approach to defense that prioritized far more than anything else, the forced transformation and reorganization and reorientation of the defense force. Little emphasis was placed on the new defense force being fully capacitated with all military capabilities for South Africa's post-apartheid post-apartheid security requirements, especially in Africa, that necessitated operations, were often going beyond its borders. So the advent of democracy in South Africa meant that a new government had first and foremost to prioritize the expended national resources on rectifying apartheid socioeconomic discrimination of the black majority. As such, the Mandela government's focus on the armed forces was restricted to the transformational aspects of ensuring robust and stable civil-military relations in a democracy, almost as the first principle, rather than adopting its departure point and appraisal of the strategic environment within which South African defense found and would come to find itself. Subsequently, the ideal balance between the two main tenets of South Africa's defense policy, national defense and foreign security responsibilities, had not been attainable. This defense predicament, the imbalance between functions and capabilities, generated a wider debate over the domestic and foreign policies of the post-apartheid governments. It also led to suggestions that South Africa has taken on more obligations than it had the capacity to deliver on, and that the country should rather rationalize its foreign policy goals that have defense and security implications. The defense predicament that South Africa faced was not the result of overextending its armed forces, as I argue. The juxtaposition of the defense forces' domestic obligations against its participation in foreign missions doesn't call, in my chapter, for a contestation between the two. Promoting peace and security on this continent is both a requirement and an obligation of the post-apartheid governments. The state must, after all, ensure that it has the ability to provide both domestic security and carry out its foreign policy objectives. But the predicament stems from the inability to adequately consolidate and capacitate the defense institutions of the state in an environment characterized by the twin pressures of late state making and the need to respond to a multitude of unforeseen functions that reside between war and peace. However, over the past 2 decades, the state of readiness of the defense force has waned, and there's been a strain on maintaining our core capabilities. And this has compromised the ability of the defense force to become a fully equipped and operational force internationally. This defense predicament has not been left unresolved or unaddressed. Accepting that the policy imperatives of our first defense review in 1998 had become less relevant and less applicable, a new defense review was initiated in 2011 to produce an updated national defense policy that is adequately aligned to our government's strategic intent. The need was for a new defense policy that provided for the complete spectrum of government's defense responsibilities and to clearly indicate the capabilities required for those responsibilities. So the new defense review contains a steadfast understanding that South Africa's military capability must be commensurate with the country's international status, its overall strategic posture, and its continental responsibilities. There's a clear and inextricable link between national security, foreign policy, and the defense operations. As such, the SANDF is viewed in the new defense review as a vital and unique tool that complements the South African government's diplomatic efforts and helps to enhance its influence on the international stage. This defense predicament that I've articulated in my chapter, I've come to realize is increasingly not very peculiar to South Africa. Overextending the functions of armed forces have become a reality for various countries, and you probably can tell from just viewing your news on a daily basis. So that's basically what I did in the chapter. Let me tell you what I didn't do. I didn't speak about the arms deal for obvious reasons, or write about it. But on a more serious note, I didn't really predicate my chapter on any international relations, or let me say even more specifically, security theory. It is not reflective of theory. It's reflective of a policy shift. and a paradigm shift that based on reorientated policy, which had become a bit outdated. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's fantastic. And Dr. Mashabane has joined us. I acknowledged all the ambassadors before. I think the EU ambassador, though, is here, so we welcome him as well. All protocol observed. All the others I had acknowledged before they come, so they can be rest assured. So the next speaker needs no introduction, which normally means I'm going to go ahead and read a long introduction. Professor Eddie Maloka is CEO of the Secretariat of the African Peer Review Mechanism. He is also adjunct professor at Wits School of Governance. He was special advisor to South Africa's foreign minister, the one before the current one, and he was also the special envoy to the Great Lakes. He was CEO of the Africa Institute of South Africa. He obtained his doctorate from University of Cape Town and is widely published. And I just want to say, because we have quite a lot of students here, it's also an opportunity to engage with people in the foreign ministry, defense ministry, and if you want to become an international public servant, then listen closely to Eddie. Thank you.
No, Adi, thank you very much for inviting us, and also thank you for putting together this this event, and also for inviting some of my friends here who are here. I'm sure there will be an opportunity to engage later. Just to say that when I wrote the chapter that is in the book, I looked mainly at the South Africa's relations with the African Union, ideological questions, or you can say the evolution of the ideological underpinnings of that foreign policy, and then the programmatic issues. But since then, a lot has happened in South Africa. As you know, we now have a new administration, a new foreign minister, and a new team. And my brother here, at that time he was in Brussels, now he's back, he's now have a new responsibility. And at the level of the African Union, we now have a new commission. So a lot has really changed, and it's now with the drive within the African Union for the reforms of the African Union. And within South Africa and within the foreign ministry, there's now some reflection on the lessons learned in our foreign policy over the last 9 or so years. So people are looking, there's an exercise to look at what are the strengths and what are the areas which require some improvement. So it's irrelevant somehow, the chapter. So you can use the chapter more as a historical, just as a point of reference. It's not really useful at all. But I just want to touch very quickly in the minutes that have been allocated by the chair to say that currently now, when you look at South Africa's relations with the African Union, you have to look at the relations in the context of the ongoing reforms. And just to say quickly about the reforms, because now when you talk about the reforms, we talk of the AU reforms as if they are the beginning. They just happened now. And just to say that post-Cold War, there have been 5 waves of reforms of the African Union. I don't want to go to the period of the OAU before then. The first one, of course, was a series of reforms of the OAU which led to the birth of NEPAD and the APRM. And that was led by President Thabo Mbeki, and I make reference to it in the book briefly because we created NEPAD and we did all that. And then the second wave of reform was the transition from the OAU to the African Union, which was actually led by Colonel Gaddafi. Even though that there were other actors, he's the one really was driving and saying that the steps that are, or the stages that are in the Abuja Treaty are too slow, are too far, we must move very quickly, and there was reluctance. He really pushed, so you can attribute the birth of the African Union, really, without saying others didn't play a role, but to the force and the role that Colonel Gaddafi, the late Colonel Gaddafi, played. And then the third wave of reforms is, of course, the union government debate. There was subsequent to that a debate on union government, the establishment of a government of the continent, the federation of the United States of Africa, and so on. And then out of it came out what we call the Adedeji report. Adedeji is his uncle, actually. So Professor Adedeji now is late, and we served in that team, and we did an audit of the African Union. So this, there was that. The fourth wave of reform were the ones that led to the emergence of what we call now the shared values. And there are several elements under it. And the first one is, of course, is that during that whole period, we saw the emergence of a number of instruments related to human rights and governance in Africa after the Cold War, which were adopted. And among the best that is known is the African Charter on the ACDEC, we call it ACDEC, and there are quite a number of instruments. The second one under the shared values was, of course, out of the Algiers process to agree on the rejection of unconstitutional change of government. So since then Africa was able to put an end to the coups that were really defining character of the politics of the continent in the 80s. The third one now is a drive towards the silencing of the guns. And then fourthly, the establishment of the African peace and security architecture and the African governance architecture. And then finally, of course, there is now a thinking within the continent that peace and security, development and governance are related and interlinked. So this is really, when we talk about the shared values, we're talking about this, you could say, familiar issues, and I can't go to that, we don't have a lot of time. But just to say that now, finally, the fifth wave of reform is what is happening currently and is associated with President Kagame, and it's mainly focused on two aspects of these broad issues of reform, which we can talk about now. One is self-financing, and the second one is institutional reforms of the African Union. But South Africa, how it relates to the African Union, I want to say that there are enablers within South Africa that enables or create conditions for South Africa to play a role on the continent. Well, the first one is that South Africa has the capacity to play this regional role. It's very difficult, it's very different from a country which does not have for example, if you say host a meeting of the African Union, it's very costly. So there are countries that will say we want to host a meeting of the African Union, but they will not have the means to do so. So South Africa has that capacity to play this regional role. It has the capacity to fulfill the financial obligations towards the African Union. It's one of the five, you could say, core financial contributors is Nigeria, South Africa, Libya used to be there, is replaced by Morocco, Algeria, and Egypt. So 5 core financial supporters to the African Union. And then the hosting of meetings and AU organs. Currently, South Africa, outside Addis Ababa, has the largest concentration of AU organs hosted by a country. And then the third one, of course, is what Segan was talking about, the peace and security role. And peace and security role is quite a complex issue, and we'll probably have a lot of time to talk about it. So it's really, that's the first set, the capacity to play the regional role. It's not an easy thing, and paying fees and hosting meetings, deploying troops, these are very costly assignments, and not every country can do that. The second one is the relative political stability in South Africa and the relatively strong state institutions in South Africa. You can see with the situation that we have gone through now that we could have problems in the ANC, but municipalities were still functioning, people were still taking dustbins, the shops were still open. But in other countries, the same crisis could result in the collapse of the state. The state will cease to function. So we do have very strong state institutions. So in order to play this role, you need relative political stability, and you need very relatively strong state institutions to back up your role, and then also to sustain your role on the continent. The third one is that South Africa has a very significant, you can say significantly, diplomatic footprint on the continent. Opening an embassy, my brother here was an ambassador, he knows how much it costs to set up an embassy. There was a time when Madam Zuma was still the foreign minister, South Africa wanted to open embassies in each and every African country. Over the years, they have slowed down, but not every country has this kind of presence. But inversely, also within South Africa, I think we say outside Washington, South Africa has the second largest presence of diplomatic presence. International organizations and all that. So it's a plus in that case. And then fourthly is the ideological underpinnings and the ideological development within the thinking in South Africa. Others referred to them, the Mbeki African Renaissance, and post-Mbeki people were talking about the African agenda. I won't go to that. And then the fifth one, of course, is continental and global goodwill towards South Africa. Because whether you believe it or you like it or not, there are countries out there that believe that South Africa should play a role. So even a number of bilateral missions that are accredited to South Africa have within them a mandate to support and to work with South Africa in playing a role in the region. So there's this general goodwill. I mean, we were involved in the BRICS how we became members of the BRICS, we're involved in how we became members of the G20 and all that. So there's this general goodwill. Countries who like to see South Africa playing this role on the continent and so on. And then the sixth one, of course, is the liberation history. Within South Africa, you feel that because South Africa was supported so much by our continent, especially the frontline states, we have a moral and a political obligation to give back, to do something, and also that also is a drive. And of course, the seventh one, Ade referred to some of it, is not only South African transnational corporation or business entities that are active on the continent, but also NGOs. You see, you go to the AU, you go everywhere, a lot of South African NGOs and think tanks are quite active, and I don't think there's any other country on the continent that has the NGOs that play that kind of a significant role in the continent, in the AU and all those kind of things, the think tanks, etc. And then finally, I want to say that we are fortunate in South Africa that we have in our country the presence of a continental intelligentsia, like Ade himself. Well, he's a South African now. But people like Ade, Gilbert, and all of them, we have them here in our own universities, and they speak, they stand up, they talk. So what they help you to do, they help the national dialogue, they help South Africa assist itself to get certain things done. So it's a plus. But there are domestic constraints, and I want to run quickly. I'm just listing things because there's no time. The first one is that there's always competing and competing priorities within South Africa. And it's an issue that I'm sure Mgodisi will talk about it. And they are dealing with it now. What do you take first, and what do you do first, and what do you sacrifice, and where do you put your emphasis? And this issue of competing priorities is a big issue. The second one, which is not unique to South Africa, but it's a big issue, is the balance between sovereign issues, national interest, versus Pan-African integration imperatives. And how do you find the balancing act? At what point, how far do you go to integrate, and how far do you go to assert your own interests in these issues? The third one is, of course, is that South Africa is among the last, if not, we can't say the last because there's still some colonies on the continent, but South Africa is among the last countries to be decolonized. When we got our independence in 1994, some countries had been independent for over 30 years. So we're relatively inexperienced institutionally, in terms of personnel, in terms of quite a number of issues, and so on. So these are some of the things. And then, of course, the structural constraints, Ade referred to them, inequality, and intergovernmental issues. Intragovernmental and intergovernmental. Within us, we see in the key actors in our foreign policy in South Africa is DIRCO, defense. My brother comes from defense. Defense is the one that deals with the deployments of troops. When we were negotiating, talking about the African response to conflict and all that, we, DIRCO, were talking about it, but the implementers were defense. So we agree at the continental level, but the implementers can come back and say, but South Africa doesn't have the capability, or we don't have the resources to deploy. So these issues of how do you find that thing? The third one on the issues of trade, it's not DIRCO that lead on the issues of trade, it's DTI. So when you negotiate the CFTA and all that, people will say South Africa, but South Africa is just a name that refers to all of us. But in effect, it's DTI, it's not DIRCO that leads that process. On the free movement of people, it's Home Affairs, it's not DIRCO. So Home Affairs, you may find that Home Affairs looks at immigration and the free movement of people in terms of security, but DIRCO looks at it diplomatically and in terms of Pan-African integration. And then, of course, you look at the role of the provinces and municipalities. We had an incident now where one of the mayors went to an international event and started misrepresenting our views. So these are some of the challenges, and I want to say that unfortunately there is not enough time. Maybe in the discussion, we can come back to some of this. I've just listed the issues. I thank you very much, but I'm taller than you. Thanks.
Thank you. That's why I didn't come too close. I realize that you're taller than I am. Thank you very much. And I'm so glad that we've been so disciplined, because we need to also show the students that if they want to go into a career either in academia or diplomacy, that these are people that have discipline and are interesting and not boring. So that we need to maintain the high level of presentation. So Ambassador MX, I can't pronounce your first name because I can't click. Ambassador MX Mkolisi is the head of global governance and the continental agenda at South Africa's Department of International Relations. He was South Africa's ambassador to the European Union, and he was head of the Africa branch also at DERCO before then. Before joining government, he was a trade union leader and was Deputy General Secretary of the South African Democratic Teachers Union. He was also a student and youth activist in Soweto. Trained as a teacher, he holds a Master's in International Relations and Diplomacy from the University of Pretoria. So MX, ambassador and friend, it's your turn. So he's going to speak from there.
No, thanks very much, Ade, for very flowery introduction, a flattering introduction, indeed. Thanks for the opportunity, and I see some of my colleagues are here, and particularly our interlocutors, ambassadors. Greetings to all of you. I cannot recognize each one of you individually, and of course, greetings to the think tank community, our students who are here, and I look forward to a very active engagement at the end of this panel presentation. I should just lift a few issues flowing from my contribution in your book of biblical proportions. And indeed, like Garen, I took the view that I should locate and situate our engagement with both the ACP and the EU within a theoretical framework. And in that regard, I situate it within the framework of progressive internationalism, which has three key elements, namely an active foreign policy, that's one. Two, solidarity and cooperation based on active engagement with both the South and the North, as well as international organizations. And thirdly, support for global norms governing human rights, arms control, and the likes. Now, we distinguish or we separate progressive internationalism from other strands of internationalism, such as liberal internationalism, which is usually pursued by so-called liberal or democratic parties, whether it's in the US or in the UK, the Labour Party, as distinct from conservative internationalism, which is normally pursued by your Republican Party in the US, but also as distinct from revolutionary or radical internationalism as pursued by Cuba. The Cuban government is legendary for its support for liberation movements, not just in Southern Africa, but also elsewhere in the world. So as the ANC, the ANC took the conscious decision to pursue or to underpin its foreign relations within the perspective of progressive internationalism. In this regard, post-94, South Africa's membership of the ACP is a concrete manifestation of the principle of South-South cooperation that undergirds its foreign policy. And its strategic partnership with the EU should be located within the broad rubric of South-North cooperation. Now, our decision to join the ACP was largely informed by two considerations. One, the strategic objective for South Africa was to frame its trade relations with the EU after the 1994 democratic dividend. The second key objective was to pledge solidarity or to show solidarity with countries of the regions of Africa, the Caribbean, as well as the Pacific. So these were the two key objectives that informed our membership of the ACP, to frame our relations with the EU within the context of the Cotonou Partnership Agreement, that's one, and two, of course, to to do so in concert and in solidarity with the African, Caribbean, and Pacific brethren. Indeed, because of our relative strength, we sought to use our membership of the ACP as a bargaining tool to make sure that we put our weight to bear in order to extract maximum concessions in negotiations with the EU, particularly on the eve of the Economic Partnership Agreement negotiations. As you know, South Africa is not part of the comprehensive of the Cotonou Partnership Agreement between the ACP and the EU. Neither are we a beneficiary, or have we been a beneficiary of the EDF. Instead, we had a separate track, which was to negotiate a trade agreement or a trade framework with the EU, known as the TDCA, Trade Development and Cooperation Agreement, which is a very comprehensive framework, not just focusing on trade relations, but also development relations, focusing on cooperation in various areas, education, health, science, and all that. Now, part of the reason why we could not be part of the comprehensive, or rather the Cotonou Partnership Agreement, was because many of the EU countries, particularly the bigger countries in the EU with a lot of voice and a lot of weight, they argued that South Africa cannot be treated as any of the ACP countries, particularly because most of the ACP countries are LDCs, least developed countries. So the EU countries, many of the EU countries therefore argued that there has to be a separate track for South Africa. It cannot be part of the Cotonou Partnership Agreement. And as a result, we forfeited, or we lost many of the benefits that are associated with membership to the Cotonou Partnership Agreement. That being said, we're able to carve a much more favorable agreement with the EU in the framework, in the context of the TDCA, which allowed us duty-free access into the EU market, but also which allowed us preferences on some of the goods into the EU market. We've since extended those preferences with the signing of the SADC EPA, which represents TDCA plus, in the sense that it gives us further market access. For instance, it increases our tonnage of wine, it increases our tonnage of sugar into the EU market, and it also guarantees the protection of some of the geographic indications, such as on goods like rooibos, Karoo lamb, and so on. We were able to ensure that those intellectual property rights are not violated, they're respected in the context of our trading relations with EU countries. Now, the ACP has really never had an existence of its own. It has largely been dependent on the EU. The relationship between the EU and the ACP countries can be described as paternalistic, based on aid and the supply of raw materials. This relationship has induced an aid dependency syndrome and entrenched the colonial economic structure and pattern in which ACP states are mere suppliers of raw materials and consumers of finished products from the industrialized economies of the North, who also happen to be the former colonial powers of the ACP countries. Thanks, Doc. Now, part of the reason why South Africa felt it necessary to engage in this relationship between ACP and the EU was really to transform the structure of this relationship from a moribund post-colonial to a dynamic modern framework based on mutual benefit, mutual respect, and partnership. This was, however, overtaken by the launch of the Africa-EU Strategic Partnership, as well as the debate about the future of the ACP in view of the impending expiry of the Cotonou Partnership Agreement in 2020. These two signal developments led to a refocusing of our engagement with the ACP and the EU. The establishment of the strategic partnership between Africa and the EU, which is now framed at institutional level as EU-AU, was a seminal development, which made us to focus most of our energies in our engagement with the EU on the Africa-EU track, but also the development around the impending expiry of the Cotonou Partnership Agreement also made us to defocus on in our engagement in the ACP. Later this month, there will be a discussion in Togo where African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries will be formulating a joint position that they are going to present to the EU on how they foresee the framework of partnership between them and the EU post-2020. The future of the ACP remains uncertain. Okay, I think I have 1 more minute. Sure. The future of the...
I'll give you the 1 minute.
Okay,
You're very
maybe you can give me 1 more.
But that's due to your seniority, Ambassador.
Okay, now the future of the ACP remains largely uncertain, largely due to a number of factors: EU expansion and its demand, the global economic crisis, the Eurozone crisis, the changing global power dynamics, as well as the significance of regional blocs such as the AU, as I've mentioned. SA relations with the EU go far back, and I won't deal with that. Save just to mention that individual members of the EU or the individual members of what was then the European Economic Commission collaborated a lot with the apartheid regime. Brussels' policy towards South Africa has gravitated from indifference to caution to unequivocal opposition to apartheid in the dying years of the regime. Countries like Ireland, Denmark, Sweden, and the Netherlands, they form the core of the progressive minority supporting sanctions and a democratic transition. The very first concrete step against apartheid regime by Brussels was in 1977 in the form of a code of conduct for European companies with interest in South Africa. This was followed, of course, by the crippling embargo that was adopted by European countries insofar as the imports of gold coins, iron, and steel. Finally, Chair, we can distinguish 3 major eras in SA-EU relations that reflect three continuous phases in a continuum. The Mandela era, the main achievement in the Mandela era was the signing of the TDCA, the Trade Development and Cooperation Agreement, which laid the framework for the trade development relations between South Africa and the EU. The Mbeki era, we see the development of a strategic partnership beyond just trade and development issues, looking also at global issues, looking at peace and security issues, and broadly at multilateral cooperation. So it enlarged, the Mbeki era broadened the agenda to an agenda that encompassed the widest range of areas of cooperation and engagement. The Zuma era, largely we can say, we saw an addition of a new dynamic in the relationship, largely the business forum, which Ambassador Konaro here has been very much passionate about. So the addition of the business dimension or the business element is something that can be credited to the administration of President Zuma. We have a challenge of resetting and recalibrating and renewing the relationship. There has been a lull over the last 5 years. From 2013 to 2018, we've never had the annual meeting of of heads of both institutions EU of the institution and South Africa of the state. We've never had that engagement. So we have an opportunity now, following a very positive engagement we had with the EU in Abidjan last year, to really reset the relationship, to recalibrate, and to place it on a much sounder footing. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think really magisterial talk. Also, Eddie, yours was actually one of my favorite chapters in the book. And what I loved was the historical connection between the ANC and Pan-Africanism and the OAU. So I wouldn't dismiss your chapter as one that shouldn't be read. I think it's a must read. So the final speaker is Advocate Dr. Mashabane. As you know, South Africa is about to become a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council next January. It's almost assured. It's jumped the queue again about 5 times. So I'm sure that Nigeria will respond soon as well. Doc is Chief Director of the UN at South Africa's Department of International Relations. He was previously South Africa's Deputy Ambassador to the UN from 2010 to 2014. So the last time South Africa served on the Council, 2011 to 12, he was actually there. And so if you have any questions on the regime change resolution, 1973, this is the man to ask. And he holds an LLM in Human Rights and Democracy in Africa from the University of Pretoria. Welcome, Doc.
I got a jet lag, but it's a different jet lag. I was in the low field, and I've been driving to the high field the past 4.5 hours. But Ada, thank you very much, Program Director, Excellencies and Ambassadors that are here, professors, members of the academic staff present, students of UJ and other neighboring institutions, ladies and gentlemen. I'm told protocol observed is breaking of protocol. So now my chapter looks at South Africa and the UN. And of course now you will see from the chapter that there's a linkage to the work that Professor Maluka has done, as well as reference to the work that Nicole has done on human rights. As you will know, South Africa was part of the founding members of the UN in 1945, the 3 only African countries with Ethiopia and Egypt. And of course, Prime Minister Smuts signed the charter and is accredited as having drafted the preamble of the UN Charter. But of course, South Africa has had during that time, since then, problematic and contradictory relationship with the UN. The UN declared apartheid in South Africa a crime against humanity, and South Africa was suspended from the UN in the 70s. And of course, as the membership grew from 52 and tripled to 150 something, particularly in the General Assembly, the UN became a center of gravity in relation to the struggle against apartheid and white minority rule in South Africa. Now, South Africa then went back to the UN in 1994 after becoming a democracy, and the world had completely changed. That was just immediately after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, and the end of the bipolar world. And of course, there were many states joining the UN at the time, from the Soviet Union and from the other parts of the East. Now, we thought it's very important then to say, for a ship as big as the UN, that doesn't just change course easily. What can a country of South Africa's size, a mid-power like South Africa, do with other states or in the company of other states or in the presence of bigger states? The approach in the chapter that we followed is more to follow the three pillars that since 2005 we have agreed are the 3 pillars that make up the UN. That's peace and security, human rights, and development. And in relation to peace and security, of course, I make a reflection on the role that South Africa has played in the Security Council. As you will know, from 1994 to now, South Africa has served in the Council 2 times, 2007 and 2008, and 2011 and 2012, and in both instances with controversies. that some of it is what Professor Ade referred to. And then, of course, we'll have to account for having participated in the drafting of 1973 that led to a regime change in Libya. But in those instances, those two instances that South Africa had served in the council, because it's all well and good to go to the council and come out, but at the end, the question is, what value do you add? One of the most major fundamental achievements that I think we still mention today is South Africa having introduced a resolution at the time called UN Security Council Resolution 1809, which focuses or seeks to expand and operationalize Chapter 8 of the Charter. For far too long, Chapter 8 was there, and in fact, the drafters of the Charter were very visionary in taking into account that sometimes in the future there will be regional organizations that could work and cooperate with the UN. So Chapter 8 of the UN Charter speaks about cooperation between the UN and regional organizations. And so that resolution expands and actually operationalizes that Chapter 8, particularly in relation to the UN and the African Union, because the African Union is the only, in the main continental body that cooperates with the UN, particularly in relation to the resolution of conflicts in our continent. So that's the most important part. But in the second stint again, we introduced another resolution called Resolution 2033, which seeks again to consolidate and build on the previous resolution. And in terms of those two resolutions, the two councils, that's the Security Council and the AU Peace and Security Council, have to have annual consultations and have discussions. And this was informed by the fact that the continent itself, as the OAU transformed into the AU and introduced its own peace and security architecture and started playing an active role in the continent, there was a need to make sure that there was a synergy between the two councils, because there was a major concern that the decisions that were being taken in New York were not necessarily aligned with the political thinking in Addis Ababa. And of course, the view that we need to resolve African problems, provide African solutions to African problems. It is a major issue. There's been a pushback ideologically because the members of the P5, they think that we want to take away their responsibility on the maintenance of international peace and security. But the consultations are going on, and there's a lot of work that has since been done, and there are some steps, actions that have been taken out of consultations with the African Union. And in that peace and security as well, we make reflection in the chapter on peacekeeping in the continent. As you will know, the Security Council deploy, peacekeeping operations in the continent and elsewhere in the world where there are conflicts as part of a tool that is employed to resolve conflicts. South Africa is not one of the biggest troop contributing countries, but the role that we have always observed that our troops play is more activist. It goes beyond your normal, typical UN peacekeeping mission. As you will know, there's always a debate about what peacekeepers can do. So the traditional understanding is that peacekeepers are there to keep peace. If there's no peace, you can't have peacekeepers, and peacekeepers cannot engage. Peacekeepers have to separate the two warring parties. However, in terms of our thinking, we have challenged that thinking successfully, and that led to the creation of what we call Force Intervention Brigade in the DRC. That is given, in fact, authority to use force against what is called spoilers and negative forces. And part of the stabilization of the Congo now, as we speak, has greatly been to the role of the FIB, the Force Intervention Brigade, that was introduced in the resolution dealing with MONUSCO. So our argument is that it's not the numbers that matter. We're not part of the top 10 in the continent, but wherever we are, if you look at Burundi, you look at Congo, you look at UNAMID where we were, our guys have always been playing a very active role. We thirdly then look at Security Council reform. One of the first speech that President Mandela made, I think he was not even a president at the time, it was 1990, to the committee against apartheid, the UN committee against apartheid. And he raised the issue that there will be a need for the UN to be reconfigured to take into account contemporary realities. So we continue to raise this issue because the configuration that we currently have of the P5 reflects the 1945 realities in geopolitics. But we think the world has changed. Some of the P5 members were powers back then. They are no longer powers now. And there are others who can carry the responsibility. However, it's not an easy exercise, but we reflect that South Africa will continue to raise this issue. Now, in terms of the human rights pillar, which I think Nicole has spoken about when I was coming in here, and I may not have had much of what she said. But what we have sought to do is to create a balance between civil and political rights and socio-economic rights. Because there's been a tendency, particularly from our friends from the West, to overemphasize civil and political rights at the expense of socio-economic rights. So we have sought to create that balance between the two. And as you will know, we have had an opportunity even back then through Ambassador Jackie Levy to chair the UN Human Rights Commission, the then Human Rights Commission, which later got transformed into a Human Rights Council because the commission was highly politicized. Some of the criticisms that we get here from home on South Africa's human rights as part of an important pillar in South Africa's foreign policy is basically out of a misunderstanding of President Mandela having said that human rights will be South Africa's lodestar, South Africa's foreign policy's lodestar. And the reality is that nobody relates with anybody in the world on the basis of their human rights record. But this misunderstanding continues. But in the main also, South Africa has signed and ratified a large number of international human rights instruments. Now, on the development pillar, as you will know, in 2002, South Africa hosted the World Sustainable Development Conference here, where for the first time, the three pillars of development was agreed that sustainable development is both socio-economic and environmental. And this was a major turning point in the discourse in the UN in relation to development. And of course, you recall that just not only the hosting, but the opportunity that when you're a president of a conference, you have the hosting of COP17 here in Durban, and the role that South Africa played in the adoption of Durban platform for enhanced action, which basically became the foundation for the Paris Agreement, which was adopted later in Paris. Now, in terms of the way forward, we posit that South Africa will continue to advance the African agenda, informed both by NEPAD as well as the Agenda 2063. And of course, at the time of the writing, we were not aware that South Africa will return to the Security Council. But I had reflected that South Africa will continue to play a critical role in matters of international peace and security. And this time, of course, the membership will coincide with the 2 years before the target date of 2020 in the Agenda 2063, that by 2020 we should have silenced the guns. And of course, the debate on the reform will continue to make sure that the Council represents today's realities. We all know about how the Council is paralyzed, the Council can't move, be it on Syria and many other matters of global concern in relation to international peace and security. And our view is that the only solution to that is the reconfiguration of the Council and take into account the new realities. I thank you.
Thank you very much. So you've had 6 varied presentations, I think, that have reflected very rich experience and tried to merge theory and praxis. So we have a few minutes to ask questions.
Direct questions.
What is your name, please, and affiliation? Are you non-aligned?
My name is Thabo Mbonani, not Thabo Mbeki, Thabo Mbonani. Yeah. I'm from West University.
Okay,
Yeah.
excellent. Welcome.
So my point is directed to Professor Edimaloka, one, and also one to Ambassador, what is
Nkosi.
this one?
No, he's not yet an ambassador.
Next door
He's
to you.
close to it.
Police. Yeah, police.
Advocate Mashabani. Advocate Mashabani. Oh, it's him. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's hear the question.
Let's start with you, Professor.
Thabo, can you please
My
watch
voice.
the game? Speed up.
Yeah, what?
Speed up.
Yeah, Professor Moroka, as you know that, compared to EU is too bankrupt. As a result, it affects their programs, like the army, the military is very bankrupt. And the people who are, countries that are more donating to the armed forces is South Africa, Nigeria, and the other one, no? So we agree that, no, that also needs to be addressed, the bankruptcy and lack of personnel compared to NATO in the EU. Yeah. And to you, Ambassador, you know that now in Africa now there's a power struggle. These two economic blocks, powers, Nigeria mainly, and South Africa. Yeah, there is. So now with regard to the UN reform, because UN represent the relics of the past, of the Cold War, no? So now, as you have said here, that no, it need to be expanded and reformed. We would think it would make sense to say, let's put Nigeria, South Africa, permanent members, not as a non-permanent members, with the veto powers, like Russia, USA, UK, they got the veto powers. What's wrong if you say to African countries, South Africa, Nigeria, and the other one, Egypt, or whatever, they must also have a permanent seat in the Security Council with the veto powers. What's wrong with that?
Okay,
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is David Mnyai, UJ. Thank you for excellent presentation, and I must say, without being biased, this is one of the best book on South Africa's foreign policy since 1994. Mine is a general one question that cut across those who can answer it. It is my understanding that South Africa always goes against the global current. Historically, if you look in 1945 with the Declaration of Human Rights document, South Africa was going the opposite direction with apartheid. And now, the world is going right-wing. The EU, the US, and where is South Africa in these currents? Is it going to follow the current kind of direction, the global trend, or to swim against the current at this time? And
Who do you want to answer that?
I'd like Ambassador Nkosi Braedi, and anyone, Ambassador Doctor, to handle, anyone who can, but I think they're in the field. They'll give us a sense of emerging trends, particularly with the emerging administration. Where exactly are we going? And where is the Africa agenda in it? Thank you.
Okay, my name is Lucky, student here at UJ. My question is directed to Professor Ed Maloka. It's a very simple question, Prof. You have indicated something about South African institutions being capable to carry the cause even during tough times, which is something other African countries can't do. I just want to ask, will that continue, or will that remain if ever we end up in a situation whereby we have a new government in South Africa? Let's take, we go in 2019, we come back with the DA in power or the EFF in power. Will that continue to happen in our country? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Mukwatski Kabili. I'm the chairperson of UJ PASMA, Pan-African Student Movement of Azania. Even though you say this chapter is not important in the book, he was saying it's irrelevant. I think it's the most relevant one because most people want to engage him on it. My question is, in the agenda that was discussed, was there ever a resolution taken to create a borderless Africa? Because remember, the agenda of United States of Africa seeks to ensure that other Africans don't become foreigners in other African countries. So was discussed if there's a standing resolution, when will it be implemented? Last question to Mr. Mashabani. I think that's a very important. I think, sorry to say this, UN Security Council is a toothless organization that only protects the interest of G5. When is South Africa going to pull out? Because now we're tired of having these permanent members, and as we are non-permanent members, you circulate. Who said, by the way, France, Britain, and China and these countries remained a superpower in 2018. And by the Security Council is used not to maintain peace, security, and order in South Africa, but total anarchy. So it makes sense logically also for South Africa to pull out in ICC, because I heard that no, South Africa played a key leading role in ICC. Whose interest is ICC protecting? We are tired of these institutions that are meant to collapse progress and economic stabilization in Africa. So basically, I wanted to say to you, it makes sense logically for South Africa, even though they played a key role in establishing the International Criminal Court, but it has never set the agenda that we had proclaimed or that we saw as an objective of protecting human rights.
Good day, good evening, everyone. My name is Mkondo. Well, I have two questions to all of the people at the panel. So the first question is, which candidate is running for leadership in limiting or hindering control of foreigners of our resources as Africa, for example? Number two is, how come is Jamaica opening up for China when China is openly practicing racism upon black people? What are you doing about that?
No, yeah, I think, Ade, thank you very much. I think, listening to students raising such critical questions is very impressive, and we must commend and congratulate UJ for the work, and personally, maybe it's people like yourself for the role you are playing, and David here in producing this quality of our students. But just to say on the questions, the question that was raised by Thabo on the financing of the AU, the Peace Fund, the AU has three budget pockets. It has the operations, this is our salaries. So I'm AU staff, so I'm paid by AU. So I should not be talking on South African foreign policy because South Africa is a member state. But I'm sure my brothers here, they know that I'm here in another capacity. But ordinarily I should not be here. I should just come and listen like ambassadors here and observe and make general statements. So there's the operations, paying for staff or telephones, etc. Then the programs, for all the programs we undertake, and then the third one, of course, is the Peace Fund, and we're talking about it. What we tried to do at the AU was that we tried to revise the formula for assessed contributions. You see, when you are a member of the AU, there's a formula we use to say David Munyai is Burundi, he pays so much, and Mkolisi Nkosi is Nigeria, he pays so much. So there is a formula, so we called it assessed contribution. So South Africa was chairing the ministerial subcommittee on assessed contribution, and at the summit here in Sandton, we managed to get the countries to agree on a revised formula. But at that time, Libya was going out because of the internal situation, so the Libyans were saying, because in that assessed contribution, we have 5 countries that are the core, they account for 75%. So then the Libyans were saying, because of the civil war, we can't. So we're having a crisis, and then we're trying to persuade the Angolans to come in as a 5th country. And Angola, of course, when the decision was taken, Angola made some reservations. So, but ultimately, now they found a formula with Morocco now having joined. Now Morocco is a 5th country. But the problem with assessed contributions is that it's not possible to base the funding of the AU on 5 countries. It has its own limitations. So when you have a crisis in a country, it doesn't matter. But even the 5 countries themselves cannot carry the burden. And so you end up in a situation whereby the budget that you get, the money you get from assessed contribution, goes largely to maybe to a little bit to operations and a little bit to programs, and Peace Fund nothing. Then our friends from the EU, they come into the Peace Fund, etc., etc. So now we are trying to see how we can try to find more innovative ways of funding. So there was a panel which was led by President Obasanjo. It came up with what we call alternative sources of funding, and we looked at the number. But there's one now that is being considered, is now being pursued, is to try to get revenue from levy that we impose on imports from non-AU member states coming into member states. So this is a formula that we're working on, and a number of countries are moving in that direction. But South Africa is not yet ready. And this is the issues that I was talking about, that when you look at foreign policy as students, sometimes we say South Africa, But within South Africa, you must see who are the lead actors. So like, for example, this is a revenue issue, so it's Treasury. So DIRCO may be ready to move, but Treasury may say we are not ready. You see, so these are some of the issues that where employees here can talk to this. So I'm no longer at DIRCO, so I don't know what is the thinking. But I know that South Africa is one of the countries that has not yet come up, move closer to this issue of the 0.2% levy. But once we have this, you are able to generate resources. But because the reality is that many of our own countries do not have the capacity to fulfill their financial obligations to our union because of their internal fiscal situation. There's challenges of domestic resource mobilization and so on and so on. But we can't go to that. Others said we don't have enough time.
Can you please just talk to the borderless Africa? Is South Africa ready to open?
No,
up
let me
its
just
borders?
quickly go through the question that was raised by David around which direction South African foreign policy is going. Policy is here, and Doc, they will talk to that issue. But all I can say, and I'm talking now, I'm a South African, but I am talking also as an observer from outside. I'm no longer at DIRCO. I think that's the question that our two colleagues need to answer.
That's why I asked you about
Yes.
the borderless Africa.
And then they can deal with that. And then the issue about the strong institutions, what I meant, whether there is a DA and EFF and so on. That's when you test the strength of your institutions. We have a DA opposition, which is opposition in the Western Cape. We have Gauteng, Johannesburg is run by the opposition, but we don't have a crisis in the country. So you test your institution not only during Christmas, but also during winter. How your institutions can withstand terrible weather, can withstand the good times, so the South African institutions, I think they have been able, I see even with our own civil servants, how we prepare for a new minister, how we prepare for a new president. There's a lot of professionalism. So if you like you see here in the city, when the DA won and came in, our colleagues were city managers and so on, they did the handover reports and they briefed the new mayor and all those kind of things. That is what is very important. And that's why I was saying that some colleagues were saying in one meeting, they were saying, we are very disappointed with what what is happening in South Africa, etc., etc. And then they were talking about certain things that were happening in South Africa, some imagined, some real. And I was saying, but South Africa has emerged out of those issues. It has not led to the collapse of the country. Instead,
I thought you didn't want to talk about South Africa.
No. I wanted to say that instead.
Well, this has been filmed, by the way.
No, I don't have a
You're
problem.
on the record.
No, I don't have a problem. All I'm trying to say is that we need strong institutions that are independent of individuals and political parties. So either you are a presidential material, you go, you run in Nigeria,
Where
I will support you to be a candidate. You win. And in Ghana, we see that's a big problem. It's actually, I must say so, that ECOWAS is taking leadership. You know, a number of countries in the ECOWAS region in West Africa, you have the ruling party losing to an opposition, and they transfer power, and there's no crisis. So this is really what we are talking about, and this is what we need. It's not something peculiar to South Africa. I was just talking about the specific case. And then the issue about my brother from PASA, about the agenda to create a borderless South Africa. That issue is led by Home Affairs. And now AU, we've got a protocol on the free movement of people. It was negotiated, has been negotiated. I think it's been signed and then it's in the ratification phase. My two brothers here are very competent to answer that. I'm not informed about the internal process, but the Department of Home Affairs has put on the website a position paper of South Africa on this. And it's an area where, you know, there are two ways to look at immigration or migration or international migration. You can look at it in Africa as a security issue. So when I come, either when he comes here, like me, I'm wearing like now, this is, people who mistake me for a Nigerian. They search me, they think I'm bringing drugs, I'm this and this, you see? So you see me as a security threat, as a security issue coming through the borders that is bringing drugs and so on. But there's another way of looking at me when I come, you can say, oh, there's the Nigerian brother and welcome me. So this is the dilemma we have in how we deal with international migration within South Africa. And I think we have not yet made that transition. And it's a big issue, but we are, as actually the APRM, we are going to go on a national tour on this debate to say where are we going and how do we deal with these issues. Is international migration a security issue or is a Pan-African integration mechanism for Pan-African integration.
Thank you.
And then the last one, it was on I wanted to say, Chairman, that you pulled us out of our offices, and so we need to at least to express one or two, and I'm not going to abuse your patience, but just to say that we need to make time to talk about the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and then the issue of the human rights, and Doctor spoke to some of them, human rights in South African foreign policy, and our sister here, she's well informed. I realize that outside government, a lot of our colleagues do not have a full understanding of what goes into our own thinking on the issues of the ICC and also on the issues of human rights. And Doctor was right. There's no single government in the world that has a foreign policy that's based on human rights. It's only in pronouncement, but there's no single country that pursues a foreign policy that's based on human rights. And that article that President Mandela wrote in it may just have been a ready-to-govern publicity stunt by the ANC. So people should stop referring to it, should look at how South Africa has now been dealing with the realities and the real politics of international relations. That was just a real, what you call a ready-to-govern pronouncement by the government of the ANC to say, we're ready to govern, this is what we're going to do. But it didn't literally and narrowly mean that one variable is going to determine our foreign policy. And then on the issue of the ICC, really, we don't have to look simply at the ICC there. We have to ask ourselves, is the ICC an international organization that is out there to assist the world with international crimes and combating international crimes, speaking for victims? Or is it a tool used by certain countries to pursue a certain agenda globally? And I think once you can answer that question, you'll be able to understand where we stand. Because the determination we have made, not just in South Africa, on the continent, is that the ICC is actually not what we thought it is. It's something else. So it's on those bases. It's not because of people are reneging from human rights. No, it's because we have come to a determination that no, the ICC is not about international crime. It's a foreign policy tool that is used against Africa by certain governments and certain countries in the world. And we don't think that it makes sense for us to continue to be members of this organization. Perhaps we should rather invest our energies in trying to build and strengthen the court that exists in Arusha and try to finalize the protocol, try to build its capacity, because there we'll be able to represent the victims and to deal with the issues of international crime on the continent, not through the ICC, which is highly politicized. Thank you very much.
So let's hear from Nicole, I suspect with a different view.
Yes, and I think you're right in that suspicion. I'm going to be brief and just address the issue of the ICC and this idea that it is essentially a tool to advance Western interests. And I think there are certain facts that need to be taken into account. One is that, a large majority of the situations that arose, that came before the ICC, that are on the ICC's docket, arose as a result of self-referrals. That means that the states themselves asked for the ICC to intervene. It wasn't as if the prosecutor came and said, this is the situation that I want to investigate. The countries themselves said, we would like the ICC to investigate and prosecute these particular crimes. And that is the majority of African situations before the International Criminal Court. It's not the totality, and there are some problems around that, but that needs to be taken into account. The other thing that needs to be taken into account is that the current prosecutor for Bensouda for the International Criminal Court is from the Gambia. A whole number of judges for the International Criminal Court are African. I think to suggest that these eminent jurists are somehow advancing interests of the West unproblematically is a very contentious and demeaning proposition in some way. The other thing to take into account is that the Palestinian Authority has sought to make a referral to the International Criminal Court to investigate crimes that have happened on the territory of Palestine. There is controversy around that because some in the West are pushing back and saying, particularly the United States, it's not a state, and so it doesn't have the power to make such a referral. But the ICC, in fact, is grappling with that request and as looking at it seriously. The fact that the United States is having a tantrum about it and threatening all sorts of retaliatory action does not mean that the ICC is purely a tool under the thumb of the United States. Finally, this idea that there's a consistent African position on the International Criminal Court is not true. And again, I think it's demeaning to suggest that positions taken by countries like Botswana and Senegal, which are in support of the International Criminal Court, are somehow, that they're not authentically African, is not right. So there is a difference of opinion on the African continent as to the position vis-a-vis the International Criminal Court. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to put those facts out.
Okay, thank you very much.
No, thanks, Ade. It's late in the day, and I don't want Doc to be talking to an empty room. Very briefly, just to say, on the question of the UN Security Council, your proposition that Nigeria and South Africa should be members of an expanded Security Council is flattering, at least to us as South Africans. As you know, there is an African Union position called Ezulwini Consensus, which is the common African position with regards to the reformed Security Council. You can read the details of that, but in essence, it calls for the expansion of the Security Council to accommodate 2 African member states as permanent members of the expanded or reformed Security Council, and 5 African member states from each of the 5 regions to be accommodated as non-permanent members of the expanded UN Security Council. The 2 permanent Security Council members of from Africa will also wield or have the right of veto. This is, in summary, the African common position. In the interest of time, we cannot go into the details and also deal with the dynamics in terms of the current debate within the UN General Assembly around the expansion of the UN Security Council. But we're flattered that you think that South Africa should avail itself of this eventuality of being a member of the UN Security Council in the permanent category. In any case, as my colleague had indicated in his presentation, we have participated in a number of peacekeeping and peace-building initiatives on the African continent. We do think that we do have the wherewithal to be a worthy member of the UN Security Council. On the question of South African foreign policy going forward, of course now we've got an opportunity to reset, and that's how I concluded in my talk on the SA-EU relations. We've got an opportunity to reset, not just in relation to SA-EU, but globally, and also to recalibrate, because foreign policy is dynamic. From time to time, you have to review global developments because we operate in a very fluid environment, constantly changing. So the world has changed to how it was 10 years ago, and we therefore have to take into consideration all these changes and dynamize our foreign policy. But the key principle that we want to establish is the principle of universality. We want to, and proportionality, and not to be one-dimensional in terms of our foreign policy focus. So we have an opportunity to do that, and that's why we'll be re-engaging, for example, with the EU and with other partners, so that we ensure that there's balance and proportionality in our foreign policy agenda. SA should pull out of international organizations. Is the comrade from EFF is still here? Okay, I can't see you, Chief. From PASMA. Oh, from PASMA.
No, it's not EFF.
It's PASMA, yeah. Okay. Okay.
He's revealing his true colors.
Okay, Paganisi. No, you see, at some point I was a student. All of us were students here.
Student activists.
Yes, and very, very radical. Not just calling for the withdrawal of South Africa, but also calling for the dismantling of these institutions. At some point, we were also, firebrands, and we were making all these agitating statements about the UN and so on. The question is, what you need to understand that we're dealing with a very complex global dynamic, and the international environment is a highly contested environment. So if you decide to disengage, you will be isolated, because even the most radical of countries, if Cuba falls in that category, are members of multilateral institutions. So it's a contested space, and it's better to fight these battles and to build alliances within, because you deal with every issue, with every case on an issue-by-issue basis, and you develop strategic and tactical alliances on the issues. So this is the approach that we've taken, because as I said, we were predicating our engagement on progressive internationalism, which enjoins us to engage and not to disengage. We can't adopt a Trump doctrine of isolationism or of disengagement. We have to engage, and this is a long drawn battle. We're not going to win everything overnight, So this is the approach that we've taken as a country. On China, we have to engage. Unfortunately, it's the second biggest economy in the world. There's no way you can't engage. The relations that China has with many African countries, Caribbean countries, Jamaica, as you have mentioned, is highly asymmetric. These countries, many of these countries need China because China has got new money. And of course, China has got less stringent conditions than those that are imposed by traditional donors and so on. And remember, many of these countries are LDCs. They don't have any productive economic base. They are only resources. The only resources that they have, they are raw materials that they export. They don't have the capacity to industrialize, to beneficiate these resources. So they're heavily dependent on donor money that's coming in. And China is providing that without any strings attached. But I agree with you. We have to engage with that dynamic to make sure that the relationship is mutually beneficial as well to developing countries, to African countries, that it is a win-win kind of relationship that does not continue to perpetuate the donor dependency syndrome of the colonial and the post-colonial times. Thanks.
Doc, you have the last word. Is the UN Security Council a toothless bulldog, as was said?
Look, it is and it is not. The reality is that there are challenges that the council is facing that the council cannot resolve, but there are challenges that the council is resolving. However, the fundamental challenges remains its structure. That this is a post-Second World War, structure, its configuration reflect the reality of that time. So even in terms of the debates and the discussions in the council, the domination of the P5 doesn't help matters. And so you think about the P5 1945, the UN only had 52 members. Now the membership has quadrupled to 193. Surely then the council itself has to be expanded to take into account other regions. Now, here's a reality, and I sympathize with your view, Nicole, but you see, the problem is that international politics, are not flat. If they were flat, in most of the cases, if you look at our constitution on matters of human rights, we will be together with the EU and the US at all material times. But there's the reality of double standards. I'm sure you know the announcement, the Americans are lifting sanctions in Sudan and so on and so forth. But even from a legal point of view, ICC, the Rome Statute has Article 16, which gives the Security Council power to defer an arrest warrant if requested to do so. you will know it is now more than 10 years that the African Union wrote a letter to the Security Council asking that the arrest warrant of President al-Bashir be deferred for a year. That's a mechanism that member states have agreed upon. But I know we were sitting where the only African state that has raised this matter in the council and say, here's a request from the AU, can you defer the arrest warrant? You must just see how the US, and you see this is where the problem was, that in fact Article 16 should be expunged from the Rome Statute. Because you are giving a power that many of its members are not even signatories to a treaty. It just doesn't make any sense. US has a say as to whether you can defer the warrant or not. But US is not a state party. They signed, they are not ratifying. Now, so I'm saying part of the challenge that I think most of our analysts criticizing the decisions that we take in foreign policy are outside and they don't either out of a situation of their own making or not, have no appreciation of the political dynamics that you have to deal with. That is not a matter of black and white, but there are political, dynamics that have to be attended to. So Security Council is paralyzed, cannot deal with the issue, the Syrian question, and you see everybody, the blame is on China and Russia. But it's not true. And people easily forget how NATO implemented Resolution 1973 in Libya. And in fact, at the time, they were even warned that the manner in which they were implementing that resolution, they are going to make it difficult to deal with any other conflict in the world. So in truth, Syria is a victim of what happened in Libya. But we just want to suffer selective amnesia and intellectual dishonesty and not face some of the realities and say, we are in this situation because of this and that. But of course, there's also the reality of P5 arrogance. And you see some of the views that even the students are raising here about the credibility of that institution. We have warned that unless you reform this council, in a few years to come, this council will lose credibility and it's going to become irrelevant. So it's toothless to that extent that there are outstanding crises that they are not dealing with. And in most of the cases, challenges are only addressed if there's a vested national interest involved. Where there's no vested national interest, take an example of Somalia. We have argued that the situation in Somalia is a threat to international peace and security. But the Security Council doesn't want to get involved. But Somalia it is. Everybody knows that the situation there is a threat to international peace and security. And the Charter of the UN says what? Says the Council is responsible for maintenance of international peace and security. And the threshold for the Council to deal with any matter is that that situation must pose a threat to international peace and security.
So we hope, Doc, that you will return to New York, either replacing the current permanent representative or working with him, but we think it will be great for you to return. And Eddie Maloka has suggested we have a debate on the ICC. So I think we'll put this on our agenda. I know you want to make a small point as well, but I hope Nicole and Doc will agree to come back, because it seems as if this is an issue we need more time to discuss. Just one small point, Professor Ambassador Eddie Maloka.
No, I'm not an ambassador. I wanted to say that, please, let's organize that seminar because we don't work from the same information base. The cases before the ICC that are a problem, Sudan, Kenya, they were not self-referrals. Kenya was initiated by the prosecutor. Sudan was referred by, I think, by the Security Council. So to suggest that...
I think Nicole said it wasn't every case.
No, but the major cases that are in dispute were not self-referrals. And then the second issue is that we as diplomats, we know what happens when countries end up referring cases. It doesn't happen, a president doesn't dream about doing it. There is a lot of back work that happens. I saw it at the ANC conference, where ANC delegates were being lobbied heavily in our Commission on International Relations. There was even an NGO there that had mobilized a lot of people to come. So we shouldn't assume that when something happens on the day, that it happens on that day, the person who's doing it had a nice dream. There's a lot of back-end work, lobbying, countries are being put under pressure, even on remaining on the ICC. Gambia was told the condition that you get money is that you must go back to the Security Council, to the ICC. So what I'm trying to say is that let's work from the same information and also the funding to the NGOs. the funding to the NGO. So when we say influence, we don't mean influence only at The Hague. There's a whole infrastructure around it. And we respect the international civil servants who work there. One of them was with us at the works at the IMF yesterday. He kept on saying, I don't work for the IMF, I represent Africans at the IMF. So there's all these issues. So they are international civil servants, they are working there, and we respect them. The suggestion that I don't respect my colleagues who work there is really unfortunate. That's really what I wanted to deal with.
Okay.
But there are real issues. Let's have this debate and let's work from the same information base.
We will definitely plan a debate on the ICC.